Welcome viewers to this very important class in literature and English. We are going to be tagging this class as the foundation and inaugural class in this subject. And in this class, we are going to be looking at the meaning of literature, the functions of literature, as well as the sources of African literature specifically. Now, when we talk about the meaning of literature, it is very important to mention that there have been several definitions that have been put forward to describe this subject. And in as much as there have been several definitions, we can also say that there have been never a well-encompassing definition of this concept. But for the purpose of this class, I'm going to briefly define the subject as the creative presentation of social issues. When we say that literature is the creative presentation of social issues, we simply mean clearly that the content of literary writings emanates from social events. Now, this also means that social happenings is the primary source or primary material from which literary writings stem from. Now, it is very important that it is at this point that literature is different from history. Whereas historical account will always directly present social events, literature will present such historical accounts in a creative way. If we must use the Civil War as a typical example, the Nigerian Civil War started on 6 July 1967 and ended 15 January 1970, between 30 months. Now, this is one of the most hefty historical evidence in our country. Now, historical accounts will always give the story of this event verbatim in a accountive manner, but literature will present similar events in a creative way. There have been several literary works that had talked about the Nigerian Civil War. To mention but a few will be Isidore Okpewu's The Last Duty. We will even also talk about Chimamanda Adichie's very important masterpiece titled Half of a Yellow Sun. Even when we move away from there, you can also see poems like J.P. Clark's The Casualties and even Soyinka's The Casualties. If you talk about plays, you will see a D. Ross play titled 48 Guns for the General. All these are literary writings that have been put forward to emanate and project the Civil War experience. But these are to a very large extent, presented in a creative manner. Now, if you must compare literature and history at this context, you will say clearly that whereas historical account is very objective, literary accounts will be very subjective. Therefore, one historical event can be presented in several and subjective manners in the literary aspect, but will always remain the same in historical accounts. Now, let's look at the functions of literature. One of the major functions of literature is that literature serves as a tool to educate the readers. Now, a continuous involvement in the reading or analyzing or even watching of literary aspects will reveal that literature will always educate the readers on what is happening in their society. Now, even in the political terrain or social realms, it is very important that literature will always serve the primary tool of exposing and educating the readers on what is happening in their society, of which may not would have been known. If I must use a very popular experience, you will also see that even to the basics of newspapers, which is an aspect of literature per se, people should say that, will always serve this very important function. Now, literature also informs. By educating and informing, we mean that it will always give basic and necessary information on things that are even occurring within and beyond the frontiers of our society. So the basic tool of information is mostly to a very large extent offered by literature or literary writings. Again, literature serves the tool of entertainment. Literature does not only serve some serious issues. Literature can serve a very important tool of humor. It can entertain people to laughter. We can see this notably in comedies and farces, which of course will always largely educate, entertain, and most importantly, expose the readers to some aspects that will cause high-level humor. It is also very important to know that literature creatively or constructively criticizes the ills and excesses of society. Now, the things that are wrongly happening in the society are what we call the ills and the excesses. So, literature also creatively and constructively criticizes these things. It is very pertinent that in post-colonial African political scenes, it is characterized with high-level financial misappropriation and other forms of public allocation to private uses. Literature will always largely creatively criticize the ills, the excesses, and the follies of the things with the aim of instituting a positive change. It is very important to know, yet again, that literature exposes readers to some social issues beyond their society. Now, literature will always, to a very large extent, educate readers by exposing them to the things that are occurring beyond their society. For example, a very good knowledge of American literature will always expose us to the things that are happening in that society. A very good number of Nigerians have not been to America before, but a good knowledge of the literature of America will always reveal the issue of racism that dominated African American social setting in the 20th century. This is also the function of literature. Also, having a very good knowledge of the apartheid South Africa has always been largely instrumental as a result of the exposure of literature. Reading the literary activities and works of South Africa, of which is also part and parcel of the stems of literature, will expose us to the things that are happening in that society. So, reading literary works beyond our country will expose us to the social incidents that are occurring in other parts of the world. Now, let us clearly look at the sources of African literature. There are many sources of African literature, but let's try to look at these five. Let's consider them. The first source of African literature is customs and tradition. Customs and tradition are twin concepts that explain the ways and lives of operations of a people in a particular place. Now, the way people operate simply signifies their customs and their tradition. Now, the customs of Africa simply will reflect in the literature of Africa. Simple. The customs of America or Europe will simply reflect in the literature of that country. For example, in pre-colonial Africa, it is very popular at the time that women were left in the background. They were subservient to the men. They were expected to be seen and not heard. But if you also follow the literature that were published at the time, you will see this culture being entrenched strongly in these works. If I should use Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart as a canonical example, published in 1958, you will see clearly how Okonkwo, the hero in that novel, was handling his three wives with an iron hand. And clearly, you did not in any sense see the popularity of women. This was actually the strongest cultural context of Africa. And then you saw that it found its way to the literature. So, customs of the people is the strong source of their literature. The second is myths and legend. Let us briefly explain these terms. Myth simply is a story that may not be real, but can also help in explaining natural circumstances. For example, we must have heard about the trickster tales of the tortoise. We have also heard about the stories of the birds who had some feast in the sky. All these are myths. There are no scientific evidence that these stories had happened anywhere or anytime, but they aid in the explanation of natural circumstances. There are many myths in Africa that explain why the tortoise has a cracked back. There are many myths that explain the everlasting enmity between the cat and the dog. There are also myths that explain why the mosquito is always finding its way to the human ear. All these stories are not scientifically proven, but they help in explaining natural circumstances. Legends, on the other hand, could be described as a person, an event, or even a social place that must have happened in distant or recent past, but has the capacity to be retentive in the minds of people. You can say that Michael Jackson is a legend because till eternity, this name will always ring in the minds of people. So the timing of legends are not the issue, but the fact that legends are always retentive in the minds of people. So legendary places, legendary events or things actually are so called because people do not forget them. Now, myths and legends in this context, therefore, will always constitute a very strong source, as we always notice them in African literary texts. Another example or source of African literature is history. Now, history is simply an event that had occurred in the past, which actually has a strong influence on our lives in the present and could also influence our behavior in the near future. A very popular example of an historical action, as we had mentioned, is the Nigerian Civil War. Now, you have seen that, like I had mentioned, many literary works that had emanated or had coined their stories from these historical acts. Therefore, history is a strong source of literature. It is a material from which many African literary works are written on. The next source of African literature is songs and music. Songs and music is simply part and parcel of Africa. Africans love to sing, they love to dance, they love to play music. Clearly, songs emanates as a strong source of African literature, because in every play, for example, you must always see this feature finding its way in and out of it, therefore constituting a strong source of African literature. The next source is folktales and folklores. Folktales and folklores are stories which had been accounted to us perhaps in oral forms, but can be preserved and handed over from generation to generation through an oral medium. Now, folktales simply are those stories that must have been told to us by others, perhaps our grandparents or parents, and then we seem to hold these memorable events and hand them over to an upcoming generation. These stories, before the advent of writing, that is in prehistory, were the strongest sources of the African identity. Therefore, on the arrival of writing as a medium to preserve African experience, these stories were transmitted to a documentary form. So these are the sources of African literature. In this class, we have succinctly explained the meaning of literature, again the function as well as the sources. I am very pleased to host you, and I urge you to watch out for our next video as we will be treating the genres or the types of literature. Thank you very much.